Hello, my name is Jimmy Fortuna and I'm the Chief Product Officer at Enverus. The presentation that we are going to give today is titled States, Nations, and Cartels, Why OPEC Plus Likely Matters More Than an Incoming Biden Administration. Just 1 year ago, the United States had made history by becoming the world's largest single producer of hydrocarbons as a nation. What a difference a year makes. After having the shale boom propel the U.S. to the highest level producer, we all suffered together globally a tremendous pandemic which has destroyed hydrocarbon demand worldwide and curtailed production sharply in many producing regions, the U.S. included. What's more, in the United States, we now have an incoming president who has declared alternatively on the campaign trail that he intends to ban or to not ban fracking. Consequently, it would be reasonable to wonder what the U.S. contribution to the future supply and demand balance globally will be, and what the incoming administration's policies will and will not have in terms of effect on that balance. We'll attempt to treat with some of those questions throughout the course of this presentation, and in particular focusing on what some of the limitations of presidential power are here in the United States, and how that power is balanced by other government forces which might or might not ultimately affect the outcome. When looking at the balance of supply and demand globally, it's helpful to start with a top-level view of supply. If we look at the chart on the left, we see contributions by region, beginning with OPEC, which is presently still about 1/3 of the world's supply. The next group is one that we at Enverus refer to as NOCAR. Now, I'm going to skip that one for a moment, but it's good enough to note right now that it's just over a quarter of total supply when taken together. Next is the U.S. with about 19%, followed by Russia, and then Canada, and the last one on the list is actually a slightly larger than Canada, and that's a combination of processing gains globally with the contributions of biofuels, which taken together amount to about 6%. Now, what's NOCAR? NOCAR, as we see it at Enverus, is non-OPEC, non-Canadian, non-American, and non-Russian production. It's an interesting group to look at. It doesn't have much in common with OPEC at all. It has some similarities to Canada and others to the U.S. It's an interesting group because at roughly a quarter of world supply, it really matters, but its behavior is difficult to understand and actually difficult to analyze because a lot of the data is rather opaque. Many don't do it. We try hard to make a good view of what NOCAR past and future looks like, because we think it's important when understanding the future of balance and where it's going to come from. So we're going to do that a little bit deeper here in the next few slides. A few moments ago I mentioned behaviors. We're going to look at behaviors of three different groupings of suppliers: OPEC, Canada, America, and Russia taken together, and NOCAR. Well, we want to look at three different characteristics of each of these different three groups. The first being, are they large? The second being, are they flexible? And the third being, what kind of control do they have under a central authority? Now, OPEC is quite large, of course, being nearly 1/3 of supply, as we saw earlier. They're also very flexible, perhaps the most flexible supplier group in the world. They can quickly decide to ramp production up or down based on what they'd like to contribute to the balance of supply in the world. The last is control by central authority, and OPEC here is generally pretty good. They have done a good job of setting targets for quite a while, and in recent years have been better at adhering to them than they have been historically. So overall, you'd have to say that control by central authority from OPEC is doing well. In brief, you could almost personify OPEC as the fellow seen here. They determine which outcomes they would like to see in terms of world price. They make what they believe are the right contribution targets toward achieving that price, and they manage themselves towards making those contributions. Now, that is taking a very complex political and economic process and simplifying it tremendously, of course, but that's pretty much how it operates, and it's been reasonably effective. It hasn't always been easy or without drama or surprises. Certainly the OPEC Plus debacle that we witnessed back in February of this year was a very dramatic demonstration of how that target production process can fail and even result in essentially production and price wars. But by and large, when OPEC itself has decided to hit certain production targets, it has done so and managed itself well. Compliance and target setting after the pandemic set hold are good examples of that. This could hardly be different, by the way, from Canada and America and Russia taken together, and we'll look at them next. What Canada, America, and Russia have most in common with OPEC is size. Taken together, they make a rather large contribution to world supply. Where they start being different, however, is flexibility and control by central authority. While Canada, America, and Russia are somewhat flexible, they are not as flexible as OPEC, and their control by central authority as a group of three nations is essentially zero. Now, Russia can decide what it would like to contribute to a greater degree than Canada and America can, but when we take these three nations together, you could consider them not controlled by a central authority. In the Canada, America, and Russia group, it's worth spending a few minutes talking about how oil and gas production in the United States is so different from the rest of the world. Unlike almost every other nation on Earth, mineral ownership in the United States is by default a private affair, with an individual landowner by default owning the minerals beneath that land. It's not really a mischaracterization to describe the production process in the U.S. as looking at something like what you see here in this picture, where an individual landowner there on the right agrees with an individual producer there on the left that they will engage together in the process of producing oil or gas from a particular asset. Subject, of course, to available financing, because this sort of work, as we all know, is very capital intensive. A lot of these individual producers in the U.S. are funded by a finance industry, and that is another key piece of the American production picture that we'll look at here in a moment. The mineral owner and producer that we saw a moment ago are actually not able to engage in the process of producing from an asset without capital backing. That's often delivered in the form of either debt finance or equity, and it is provided by the finance industry in the United States. Bankers, private equity companies, and other decision makers agree or disagree that they will back a producer in order to develop an asset. This has been a key ingredient in the process of the United States developing its shale resources, and it's also one of the reasons why the decision-making around the production of hydrocarbons in the United States is so decentralized. The millions of individual property owners, combined with thousands of producers and hundreds of financial institutions, make decisions all separately from one another with regard to whether or not they will aim to increase production from their particular holdings. This is very different from most regions of the world and is a key dynamic behind how production in America has worked in the past and how a lot of it will continue to work in the future apart from politics. Okay, now that we've taken a close look at OPEC and Canada and America and Russia, it's time to come back to NOCAR. NOCAR is very different. Its single characteristic that unites it with the other two, again, is size. Apart from that, however, it has very little flexibility and zero central control. So it's very different. And what we'll see as we go forward is that difference, oddly, could make it the most predictable part of the supply stack globally going forward. Let's take a look at that. One thing that is often considered when looking at countries that are in the NOCAR group is the base declines that are associated with projects in those countries. Now, this is a reasonable consideration because these capital projects are often quite large and they have long lead times. So here you can see historic declines from a large group of aggregated wells in each of Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. What you see on average is that this group of countries, with these examples being among many, have single well decline rates that are on the order of about 15%. Now, that's a good bit more than an oft-quoted 9%, and the range is actually wider. You'll see 15 all the way up to 21%. So you might say, well, gosh, with those kinds of decline rates, doesn't that mean that a large portion of the world's supply, approximately 1/4, could be abating quickly? And that is what, in fact, many oil bulls have based their thesis of higher prices on going forward in the years to come. As we'll see in a moment, though, it's not quite that simple. You may recall earlier that I mentioned NOCAR has some similarities to Canada. This slide helps explain that a little bit. On the left-hand side, you can see future supply contributions coming from expansions of or additions to Canadian oil sands projects. Now, what that really does is actually keep Canadian oil sands projects flat, which the chart over on the right shows. That is a combination of both Canadian oil sands production and NOCAR production. So if you look on the right, you'll see that the darkest area down at the bottom of the chart is representative of Canadian oil sands contribution. The lighter gray area above is the contribution from current NOCAR projects. Now, what you'll see is, of course, a relatively steep base decline in the existing NOCAR projects as the light gray trails off. But that doesn't mean that NOCAR is going to trail off. The next area up you'll see is a dark aqua color, and that has the NOCAR production forward from future rig additions that are already planned on existing assets. The next lighter area above that is what we may see from future projects that are likely to be sanctioned. And the last piece is projects that may be sanctioned in the future and may not. What you see here from this combination is that these two groups of stable producers, Canada from the Canadian, American, and Russia group, and NOCAR as a whole, is actually set to stay pretty steady over the next several years. So, and that's particularly the case in the next 2 years. So we shouldn't be looking for a lot of relief in terms of supply leaving the global marketplace from these two groups of producers. The reason for this is in large part the same for both, which is that these projects tend to be long lead time, very capital intensive, and they take a while to work through the system. They get approval well ahead of actually coming online, and there are a lot of projects that yet will come online as a result of prior planning and continued execution. So that's something that's important when we seek to understand the NOCAR contribution and its related Canadian oil sands contribution when we look at stability of supply and timelines. This next chart shows NOCAR breakevens compared to breakevens for onshore assets and how those breakevens have become very competitive over time. What you can see in the group that's a little bit to the left of center, which is primarily North American onshore assets, are either half-cycle breakevens, which are the dark gray, or three-quarter cycle breakevens, which are the lighter gray colors. As you can see, when you start to compare those to offshore assets in NOCAR, there's actually a fair amount of favorable comparability between the better assets in both groups. So in other words, if you have a good break-even asset in certain areas of NOCAR, whether that's the UK or Norway or Brazil or some other Latin American locations, many of them will actually compete quite favorably with onshore assets in North America. Even better are tieback projects, which you can see to the left of the onshore assets pictured in the gray. So what this means in the end is that the large cost reductions for the development of offshore assets have really made these assets more competitive. And if you're a producer that owns a balance of the two, it's not immediately clear often whether you should develop the NOCAR asset or the U.S. or Canadian onshore asset. This also speaks to the likelihood of continued supply stability from NOCAR going forward into the future. Okay, back to the United States. You may remember earlier that President-elect Biden has variously said that he would or would not ban fracking. One of the more important things to understand is that banning fracking is not actually within the power of the President of the United States. In fact, banning fracking broadly is probably not within the power of the federal government altogether. It's popular to say on the campaign trail, however, so you might understand why a politician might make that sort of proclamation if he thought it was going to help him or her get elected. While that's the case, we don't expect the president to be able to ban fracking. Now, there are other things that may come into play from policy, however, and we'll get into those. Another important limitation of federal power to understand is that the United States is very different from many of the other representative countries in the world where we have a divided form of government, meaning we are not parliamentary, but rather have a separate executive and legislative branch. In this case, the election outcome that we had just this past month indicated divided government is most likely for the next couple of years. Particularly, the upper house of the legislature at the federal level in the U.S. is most likely going to continue to be controlled by the Republican Party and the Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, while the presidency is controlled by the other party, the Democrats, with President-elect Joe Biden. That kind of divided government makes sweeping changes very difficult to make. Now, this is actually still in play because not only is the president-elect not yet seated as president, but the outcome of the elections in the state of Georgia means that the United States Senate is actually still in play. There will be a runoff there in January. It is possible that the Senate could tip to Joe Biden's party, in which case the federal government would have significantly more power to take actions related to energy and particularly oil and gas. There are still limits to those actions, however, and we'll explore those in a couple of other slides in a moment. Something else that President-elect Biden said when he was on the campaign trail is that he wanted to spend approximately $2 trillion with the purpose of making the U.S. electric grid carbon-free by the year 2035. As much as Mr. Biden might like to make that kind of campaign pledge come true, he will most likely need the cooperation of lawmakers in the U.S. Senate, most likely to be led by a Republican opponent in the name of Mitch McConnell, as previously noted. Whether or not President-elect Biden can cause that kind of capital allocation by the government to take place is a material question when we think about the future production of hydrocarbons, as the U.S. government will partially fund that expansion, but the remainder of the capital is likely to come from the private sector. Those private sector investments would find themselves allocating capital toward perhaps renewables as opposed to expansions of or continuance of oil and gas investments. And we certainly see capital allocations like that already beginning to happen today. So this is a material question for us as we think about policy, but it seems likely that U.S. government policy will be more divided than united on this point and perhaps not create as big a shift as some renewables proponents in the U.S. might like. Let's briefly take another look at another way in which U.S. government is divided. As you may be aware, the United States has a federal government, but each of the 50 states that are part of the Union have their own governments as well. And these states have jurisdiction and domain and control over things that the federal government in many cases does not. One of the most important of those is the arrangements between private owners of property and anyone that they would like to do business with. This is perhaps the single most important reason why a president like Joe Biden would not be able to universally ban fracking across the United States. Those property ownership and contractual relationships are governed at the state level, not at the federal level for the most part. Another key point is that environmental and other regulations that are not controlled by the federal government are controlled by the states. So an example in the state of Texas that's relevant would be whether or not producers are allowed to flare associated gas in a basin like the Permian, and how producers dispose of wastewater associated with water production from fracked wells. So these and other things complicate the federal government's ability to control down at the state level. Some of those other things include the building of infrastructure, so things like pipelines, for example. And in a state like Texas, which has both large production and pipeline access to major ports in the state of Texas, they have a greater degree of control over the ability of transporting produced hydrocarbons than, say, for example, a state like Pennsylvania, which, while it is rich in natural gas, is essentially landlocked and must depend on the building of pipelines through other states that may or may not wish to have those pipelines constructed. Lastly, the states themselves often have high budget dependencies on the taxes associated with the production of hydrocarbons. And this leaves a number of hydrocarbon producing states like Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, North Dakota, and others, with the locals actually preferring the production of hydrocarbons because it's beneficial to budgets in many cases. So this is just another check and balance in the U.S. system that indicates why a single official such as the president cannot direct as much of the choices with regard to energy as you might think, or as might be the case in other countries. Now would probably be a good time to talk a little bit more about the private sector and how it influences hydrocarbon production in the future. This chart shows just how significantly the focus of E&P companies in the United States shifted from production growth to free cash flow margins at the beginning of 2020 as a result of the production curtailments and previous pressure from investors combining to create a focus on free cash flow. Now, this is actually really important because it enhances the ability of the sector to attract future investment, which is something very important to maintain current production levels and have any chance of future production growth. As we'll see in a minute, this sort of change in behavior is actually beneficial in terms of making the U.S. hydrocarbon industry more competitive with other potential users of capital. As we can see here, the competitiveness of the hydrocarbon industry in the U.S. with regard to having the investability that comes from free cash flow margins is becoming more competitive with other industries. So if, for example, we look at what a future price projection of $45 for West Texas Intermediate and $3 for Henry Hub would show us in the future, looking forward, we would see that natural gas-focused E&Ps, mid-cap E&Ps, and large-cap E&Ps actually are more competitive with a larger number of industries going forward in terms of attracting capital. More so than all of the ones that you see to the right of the red outlined boxes here on the chart. Notably, those include healthcare, mining, and many other sectors. You'll notice that one of the least competitive is renewable independent power producers, that is, power producers that are not part of a regulated utility directly. This is notable for reasons that we can talk about in future discussions. If we see $50 WTI and a little bit higher on Henry Hub, you can see that the E&Ps become even more competitive, really among the most competitive sectors pictured here. This is important because, as we know, we are a very capital-intensive industry in the energy business and require a lot to keep production levels up, much less grow them. This chart gives you a sense of just how much U.S. production can maintain even at price levels at $40 for West Texas Intermediate and $45. As you see here, we have quite a number of different areas in the U.S. We at Enverus take the major plays and break them down into small slivers of production based on their type curves and their indicative break-evens based on what we know about costs. And as you can see, there are large areas that can make money purely on dry gas with no oil production at all, or essentially a WTI price of zero, and quite a number that can produce at high volumes in places like the Delaware and others, really many other basins in the U.S. and specific areas that can continue to generate production even at these low prices. This is material, as we'll see in a moment, on production forecasts looking forward. What you see here are several different scenarios for future U.S. production based on different price presumptions. So if, for example, we were to look into the future, we see that we could have, with the orange line, which begins at the end of 2020 and into 2021, essentially a maintenance level of today's current production, perhaps slight declines moving forward if we stayed at WTI prices of $45 indefinitely. If we saw a price increase to $50 per barrel, you would see that the aqua-colored line would gradually increase in slope over time, and we would get from where we are today to approximately 12 million barrels by 2025. With a price stimulus of $55, we would see production go all the way up to pre-pandemic levels. And what our Enverus base case indicates, which is the dark green line, is something that is kind of in the middle. What we expect to see actually is production levels to decline slightly, but more or less stay where they are today through the end of 2022, approximately 2 years from now. At that point, we expect to see a small pinch in supply and to rebalance a price signal that will bring prices and production back up as we look into 2023 and 2024. We may, in fact, get back to the levels that we were prior to the pandemic, but we will not probably take a straight line there. That's what our current base case indicates, and we can share more information about that at the appropriate time. When determining the impact of an incoming Biden administration, there are two final things that President-elect Biden indicated that his policy preferences would show if he were elected president. One is the lifting of sanctions on Iran by re-entering the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action abandoned by President Trump. The other is the increased stringency of environmental regulations that are under the control of the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. Speaking of those providers of capital, let's return to them for a moment. One thing that's true regardless of the incoming administration's likely policy choices or things that they can get Congress to go along with is that investors are already beginning to seek significant additions to their portfolios in the form of renewable investments. You can see that in the makeup of the private equity funds and their limited partner preferences, as well as several other things that we keep track of. But the data available worldwide, in fact, clearly show that the current investments into renewables worldwide have grown rather dramatically and are likely to continue to do so. So you might ask, what are the comparative returns on renewable investments versus hydrocarbon-related investments? We have, in fact, asked that, and are beginning to see some results of early examinations that give us an idea of what the returns are, comparatively speaking, between new energy projects and hydrocarbon projects, depending on certain variables. We'll examine those next. This chart shows us what hydrocarbon projects screen, or rather how they screen against certain renewable projects based on certain assumptions. Those assumptions in this particular case are renewable projects that are unlevered, meaning not relying heavily on debt, and are unsubsidized by things like tax credits for production or initial capital investment. You can see that all but some of the least desirable or lowest performing hydrocarbon investments are in the gray and the orange, are actually outperforming the renewable investments, which appear in light green. While that prior slide was interesting for a variety of reasons, this one shows the current reality more accurately. When we look at the benefits that renewable projects in the United States receive today as a result of tax credits and lower cost of capital for them versus hydrocarbon projects, you can see that while they begin to space out a little bit more and separate from one another, many more of them screen much better against a larger number of hydrocarbon investments today. This most accurately represents the current state of affairs based on current U.S. policy and the preference of investors. This is likely to continue in its current form unless policies are changed rather than enhanced or expanded in favor of renewables. While the current investment tax credits and other tax credits associated with renewables are set to expire soon, it is very likely that a Biden administration and even the current Congress would extend them further. They already did previously, even under President Trump. So a picture that looks like this is probably likely to continue in the future, in our view. And if Joe Biden gets his way, that may expand even much further. We'll take a look at one form that might take in the next slide. It might be reasonable to ask, what would happen if, on top of the current policies that we already see here in the U.S., we were to see a $20 cost of carbon imposed by some form of carbon tax? What we see is that this would add approximately $6.70, ranging up to $10 per barrel of oil equivalent, should such a policy come to pass, in addition to the financial benefits already shown by the tax credits and the lower cost of capital. In that case, you can see that the renewables investments screen better than the large majority of hydrocarbon-based investments. This sort of future might be possible. President Biden would probably like something like this to occur based on his stated policy preferences. With the current division of Congress, should the U.S. Senate remain in Republican control, such a policy as this one seems unlikely, although not entirely impossible. Should it come to pass, this would of course make capital even more expensive for hydrocarbon-based projects and quite possibly curtail production from the United States in the future, although such a policy unfolding would likely take time, even if it does occur in the next 2 years prior to the next round of elections, which affects the makeup of the House of Representatives and the Senate, which are the judicial counterparts to the presidency. So in short, we may see something like this in the future, but at present it would seem at least as likely that we will not. So, what do we conclude from this? A few things. First, we should not expect NOCAR production declines to make an opening for higher prices and therefore expanded U.S. production for the next 2 years or so. Accordingly, the Enverus base case shows that U.S. production will likely remain as it is today for about 2 years or so if OPEC continues to seek balance in supply and demand as they have in 2020. The incoming Biden administration's power to affect world hydrocarbon markets is most directly the result of the president's power in relation to U.S. foreign policy, specifically the possibility of lifting Iranian sanctions. This could return as much as 2 million barrels of supply to the world market, and relatively quickly should Biden take such action. The Biden administration's ability to make large, rapid changes to oil and gas production in the U.S., however, is actually quite limited. Only on U.S. federal lands, which account for a very small portion of total U.S. production, could the president's changes make a more rapid impact. Longer term, however, other presidential actions, including more stringent regulations and or the ability to affect government policies working with Congress that make renewable investments more attractive, could have bigger impacts in future years, especially if such actions make it more attractive for investors to invest in renewables than in hydrocarbons. These are things that we have yet to see, however. Future events and future politics are likely to have a significant impact on whether or not we see such changes in the U.S. So it's very much to be determined on some of these fronts. Thank you for your time. We very much appreciate it and look forward to interacting with you in the future.